Live.
Hello, fellow viewers and listeners. Welcome to another edition of Socialist Action Webcasts. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and don't forget to put your questions in the YouTube webcasts for the Q&A. My name is Elizabeth Bice and I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, a past secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississauga and the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in the place called Toronto. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporation and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is Newfoundland, fighting the Furey-ous cuts, featuring Victor Morgan, Socialist Action Atlantic Branch organizer, speaking from Costa Bays, Newfoundland and Labrador, plus discussing Chris Wanamaker in St. John, New Brunswick. Victor will speak up to 25 minutes, followed by Chris for about 10. After that, we will take questions written in the chat column from the online audience. So, let's begin. I am pleased to welcome Victor Morgan. Victor is the lead organizer of Socialist Action Atlantic Branch. He is an occasional writer, a lifelong socialist, and member of the LGBTQ plus community. He resides in Coast of Bays, Newfoundland, and has almost spent his entire life on the rock. So welcome, Victor.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a great introduction. I don't know if I'm all that good, but here we go. So we're here on this webcast to talk about the upcoming cuts to Newfoundland, which is historically a province that has always faced cuts. We've always faced a deficit. We've always faced debt. There's only been 10 years since Confederation that we haven't had a deficit, that we haven't faced debt. So it's not a surprise that this is another mounting few years of a buildup. So the province itself has $47 billion in debt. That is not a small amount of money. That is not something that you can just scoff at and throw away. So yes, obviously it has to be dealt with somehow. However, austerity is not the way to do it. We've seen time and time again, austerity, it just hurts the public. It just hurts the regular people of whatever province or country it's used in. But it seems that is the road that they want to go down to fix our deficit. So who are the people of Newfoundland? We're not a complicated people. We're fishermen, we're carpenters, we're builders. Much of our lives are spent doing physical labor. It's not a complicated province, but it seems to be if you look at it from a governmental standpoint. We've always faced mismanagement constantly of our programs and of our funds. So what does mismanagement in Newfoundland look like? It looks like crumbling infrastructure. It looks like crumbling healthcare. It looks like a failure of the education system. And I don't use these terms lightly. Our roads are, in many places, dangerous to drive, not just for damage done to your vehicle, but potential loss of life. It's easy to dig a tire in and tear it off your car because of broken up concrete. There's many areas where the roads are nearly impossible to plow due to complete and utter disregard of repairs, where the plows will literally catch in the road and tear part of it up. And we've had entire roadways that had to be closed down because they had to go in with tractors and pull the plow out of the ditch because it caught in the road that is so horribly maintained that it's not safe to drive on. It's not something that happens rarely. It's 3 or 4 times a year in the winter here. Couple that with the additional road plowing problems of just not having them plowed at all. Smaller communities rarely see a plow the amount of times that they should. And not only is it rare, but it's in the worst time. My home community of Phillips Head is about 140 people. And it's not huge. It's not a big place. There's no capitalists down here bringing in $1 million a day. There's no Walmart. There's no big grocery store. It just doesn't exist. But the people here should not have undrivable roads because of that. There were 3 or 4 days in a row down here where a plow just didn't show up. Snowbanks on the roads rose 1, 2, 3 feet high. Entire sides of the roads were undrivable. That isn't rare. That isn't surprising. Imagine if you're an emergency driver. Someone calls for an ambulance. How are you supposed to get there? How are you supposed to arrive to potentially save someone's life in the dead of winter when the roads are not drivable? When there are no roads, if you look at them from above, it's just endless snow. And that's not a surprise to us here in the province. Our healthcare is another thing that has fallen to the wayside, it seems. The closest hospital to here, the town of Phillips Head, is roughly 25 minutes away. It had its emergency hours cut down from 24 hours to 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Now, I don't know if anyone in the audience has had a medical emergency, but they generally don't tend to stick between the hours of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Your thyroid's not going to act up between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. just because the hospital's not open. It's ludicrous to expect that. And that hospital services a few thousand people. The town of Botwood alone has a population of nearly 4,000. So nearly 4,000 people live within 2 minutes of it. And the other communities within, half hour, 45 minutes, maybe even an hour. And if it's not open, the closest hospital is Grand Falls, which is 40 minutes away from the town of Botwood. So say you live in Fortune Harbor or Cottles Cove or Ritter's Arm, which are smaller communities, mostly cabins and old growth Newfoundland communities. You could be faced with a potential 3-hour drive to a hospital for an emergency. That's not survivable in most cases. If you're having a heart attack or, you had an accident, you're not going to make it to a hospital. 3 hours is too long. 3 hours is too far. And there's nowhere to airlift someone out down there. There's almost nowhere for a helicopter to even get that they could leave. There's no landing pad. There's no area that is used commonly to pick people up. You have to literally fly over someone's house and hope that you can get a gurney into the helicopter. That's not sustainable. The price of living in a community you grew up in shouldn't be your life just because the healthcare system's underfunded. And even if you do get to a hospital, in an emergency wing, your wait times could be anywhere between 4 to 8 hours, depending on how busy the hospital is or depending on how many doctors they have on. The town of Botwood, again, almost 4,000 people. They have one doctor on, usually, supported by a team of nurses, but one doctor. So if 3 or 4 emergencies come in at the same time, what are you supposed to do? There's no one to see you. They have to go down who's most serious or who came in first. So many Newfoundlanders, even when it comes to an emergency, just won't go. They'll hope for the best. They'll hope the chest pain stops. They'll hope the headaches stop, but there's no guarantee for that. They do that in the face of 4 and 5 hour wait times, 2 and 3 hour drives just to the hospital. And that hospital was promised in our most recent election another $20 million in funding and full staffing. That was a promise made by many politicians on the Liberal side. And we now hear in the House of Assembly that they never said that. They never once said that. They never uttered that, never said it on the news, never said it on the campaign trail. It just didn't happen, which is, of course, completely false. We have video proof that they've made these statements. They've made these claims. And now they don't wish to back it up just because Newfoundland's not doing good fiscally, which is not a good enough reason to not give people the health care they need. That is completely against everything that is supposed to be Canadian and everything that is supposed to be in Newfoundlanders' blood. We're supposed to help people. We're not supposed to stay idly by just because we don't have the money, which seems to be the route that our government's taking. It's not just our healthcare or our roads and not even provincial infrastructure. There's a bridge near a town called Bishop Falls that leads to Grand Falls between Gander. It is a mainline part of the Trans-Canada Highway. Roughly 10,000 vehicles a day pass over that bridge. That bridge was built in the 50s. It was only now, in the 2010s, begun repairs and replacement on the bridge. So that was supposed to take 3 years. And it took 6, with many full seasons of no work being done on it. No construction, no movement, no repairs or deconstruction of any kind. There were just empty lots where construction teams used to be. And the town itself raised many questions over that. Many concerns. The mayor, everyone in the town, many times asked where they are. Where's the money going? Is someone going to fix this? It took 6 years to replace the bridge. And it cost $22.4 million for one bridge. For a single bridge, it cost $22 million. They're redoing, in this budget, the upcoming budget, an entire swath of the Labrador Highway with $22 million. So what's the difference? Why is it that when Newfoundland needs something done, it costs an insane amount of money compared to what it would in any other province? You wouldn't hear a 80-foot bridge needing to be repaired costing 200 and something million or 22 million or 50 million. You wouldn't hear it. But in Newfoundland, it's constant. Our construction costs are through the roof all the time. It's not something that's rare. It's every single construction job we need done, resurfacing roads, rebuilding bridges, rebuilding wharves, government property. It's always through the roof. And like I said, it's not just our roads. Our water systems in Newfoundland have almost entirely failed us in rural communities. If you live in St. John's, you're probably fine. If you live in Corner Brook, you're probably fine. Even in Gander, you're probably fine. They have a population of about 11,000. You're not doing too bad. Once you drop below 5,000, you're probably not going to drink the town water. Bowwood, again, 4,000 people. They had a boil advisory, a boil warning, which is, hey, don't drink the water unless you put it on the stove first. And again, 4,000 people. Boil warning. In a town of 4,000 people, they don't have the money to repair their pipelines. They don't have the ability. So it's something that we live with all the time. And the local politicians are always on the side of the people when it comes to this. They're always fighting for more funding. They're always fighting for a better situation for their communities, a better management, better communication. And that just doesn't come. It just doesn't happen. So let me put this in perspective a little bit, because most people, when they hear boil warning, don't understand the full ramifications of it. My partner lives in that town. And earlier in this summer, for 7 days, that's an entire week. Again, this town has jobs, workers, entire community systems, town halls. It's a full town. There's nothing here that makes it look like a small bay area of Newfoundland. 7 days where they could not bathe in, wash clothes in, or drink the town water. There was no boil order. There was an advisory not to drink the water because it wasn't safe. You couldn't boil it. It didn't change anything. It just wasn't safe. 7 days it took them to repair this problem because the town didn't have the money. They simply didn't have the funds to do it. So why is it that the communities around Newfoundland have to suffer? Every time it comes up that we need to repair something, it's always on us. It's always on the little guy. It's always on the small community. The provincial government seems to only care when the problem comes from a larger community or from a corporation. If you're a corporation in Newfoundland and something goes wrong, you're covered. The subsidies for oil and gas companies fly off the shelves like they're a dime a dozen, and they're the main cause of our deficit. And indeed, the massive cost of our deficit balloons every year simply because we have a large deficit. So the interest on the deficit is what we're trying to pay off every year. We're not paying down the deficit. We don't have a way to do it. We just pay the interest off, hoping for the best next year, which, as anyone who's ever held a credit card knows, is an almost impossible task. So why is that the goal? Why is that the goal, to just pay down the interest on the deficit, when there are clear socialist policies we could take? Completely radical policies, mind you, yes, but we could do it. And it'd be easy. It's not something that's difficult. We just need to make the decision to do it. But we won't. So why won't our government take that action and make those decisions? It's because they're all friends with those corporations. They're all friends with the millionaires. There's no one in Parliament who's a poor person. There's no one in the House of Assembly who is going to not make it to their next paycheck. There's no one who's going to not be able to afford their rent. There's probably no one in the House of Assembly who even has rent. They probably own every bit of property that they have and rent a couple more properties. So why the difference in Newfoundland care from small communities to larger communities? There was an initiative not too long ago to downsize the amount of small communities, to bring people into larger places of living. So the government would give you money if you decided to leave your home, the town you grew up in, the town your ancestors grew up in, your parents lived, your grandparents lived, to move into a larger area of living. In Newfoundland, that's not something people want to do. It's not something people are interested in. Many small communities are bayside communities. They're built around systems of water. They're built around harbors. That's where Newfoundlanders want to be, around the water, and we're just not getting the support to stay where we've lived for centuries. But if you're a corporation, you have nothing to worry about here. Newfoundland ranks as one of the most favorable places for corporations to do business. Our tax policies are extremely favorable when it comes to that. If you're a millionaire, billionaire, you're treated like king here, which is clear in this upcoming budget. So how has the reaction been to that? For decades, it's been horrible. The reaction's been horrible for decades. We are in constant combat with our politicians, constant combat with our public politicians who are supposed to be for us and who do indeed many times fight for us. But then when it gets to the House of Assembly, there's no conversation to be had. When it gets to federal politics, there's no conversation to be had. So we're told up front, yes, we're for you. We're going to fight for you. We're going to make sure that things get better. And then nothing happens. And then the year after, the same conversation's had, and then nothing happens. And government communication during COVID has been complete and utter living hell. All of our government buildings are almost entirely shut down. There might be one or two people inside, but you're not getting in. You can't go in unless you call and make an appointment. And you're not getting in within 24 hours. They might call you and give you an appointment in the next 7 days, or they might not. And that doesn't work for Newfoundland. We have an extremely aging population. We have the oldest population in Canada on average. And how many 80-year-olds and 90-year-olds do you know that are going to whip open their laptop and go on their mygov.nl account and go in and renew their license or get their stickers or see what they're getting back in HST or go in and see if they can get any kind of insurance for their health care or their doctor's bills or anything like that? They don't. It normally falls on a younger member of their family, a younger generation, to walk them through the process. And not every elderly Newfoundlander has that. There are many that require the in-person aid of a government assistant to get their government accounts in order, to get their paperwork in order, and they haven't been able to do that. There are many people here in this town that have things on the back burner that they've had on the back burner since COVID started because they don't know how to use a computer. They don't know how to go in and check their MyGov account. They don't know how to do any of that. So they need someone to bring them in, go into a government office with them, sit down with them and explain to them things, go through things with them, talk to them. But they don't because it's too much of a hassle. It's too difficult. The contact just isn't there anymore. So what are we to do? What are we supposed to do? We complain, we call, we send emails, we can do whatever we want. It's just the way it has been since COVID started. The province isn't happy about it. Every politician knows the province isn't happy about it. Our government buildings being shut down has been such a horrible curse to Newfoundlanders. And it's not just our main government buildings. It's any government building. Newfoundland Labrador Housing, which is a housing subsidy program for people who don't have the money, who need help getting a home. They're not open. You have to call and make an appointment. Again, you might get one. You might not. So what has that all led to? It's led to province that doesn't trust its government anymore. It doesn't believe its government anymore. When they say things are coming, they don't come. They don't show up. They don't manifest. And we just hope, again, that maybe next year it'll happen. Maybe the year after it'll happen. That's something we've dealt with since Confederation, basically since Newfoundland was a province, because even before Confederation, our government wasn't exactly, a socialist utopia where every person had a voice. It was still a very much capitalistic society. So what can we do to fix this? Well, we could have an election. We could vote. We could vote for somebody a little bit better. Except that didn't work the last time. The last election we had just in the last fall was extremely problematic from the word go. It was definitely interesting, not something we normally go through. Our premier was appointed, which happens. It happens all the time. If premier decides that he no longer wants the job or he wants to retire, he can appoint someone to the position, which is fine. And that person has a year to run an election to be legitimately voted in as the premier, which Andrew Furey did during the height of a wave of COVID. So during the height of this wave of COVID, he decided to call an election. 6 months before his time was up that he had to, he still had another entire half of a year to call an election. But he didn't. He did it right before a wave of COVID hit. So what was the answer to this first, during this election? Well, the answer was nothing. The plan was to go on ahead with the election as elections do. In-person voting was go. In-person voting stations were set up. They were ready and raring and prepared for the election. Until everyone walked out of the in-person voting sites, until hundreds of voting clerks walked off the job because it wasn't safe, because they knew it wasn't safe. There were no vaccines back then. COVID was unstoppable. We had a mask mandate. We had a social distancing mandate, sure, but that's not entirely 100%. You can't be sure that someone doesn't have it when they come in. You can't be sure that someone's going to respect social distancing or even respect a mask mandate. We've had a huge problem with that here in Newfoundland. So the decision to fix that was a little revolutionary, but it was also problematic in its origin. So the idea was mail-in voting, which is great. Mail-in voting is extremely democratic. It's a great decision when done correctly. And this time it wasn't. It was almost purposefully done in a way that benefited the people who stood to get voted back in. So the mail-in voting extended the voting period. When originally it was supposed to be a weekend or a few days, it ended up being a month, and then 2 months. And our voting period from when the first vote was cast to when the cutoff date was for the last vote to be cast was almost 3 months. And even with that time gap, even with that extreme extension of time, most Newfoundlanders didn't vote. A turnout of 46, which is historically low. It hasn't been that low in 10 years. And that was mail-in voting, which is easier than in-person voting. It was partially that low because a lot of people didn't get ballots. I myself got a ballot probably 2 months ago for an election that was over a month and a half before that. That's when I got my ballot. So who else got a ballot months later, weeks later? Who didn't have the ability to vote at all? Because that's what it did to a lot of people. And we had our premier to be hand delivering ballots, bringing them to people's homes. During COVID, during a wave of a variant of COVID, walking to people's homes in person to deliver ballots. If that's not fishing for votes and extremely ill-advised, I have no idea what that is. So what other issues arose during our election with the mail-in system? Well, I shouldn't say the mail-in system. It arose from who ran the mail-in system. So our electoral officer, who was running this election, decided that he was okay with himself and the vote counters to take home voting kits to bring them to their own personal homes, which is wildly illegal under our election laws, wildly illegal. And you think an election officer would know that, but he did it anyway. So the votes went out of government care. They went into personal homes to be counted, which is insane. That's never happened before. That's something that we've never had to deal with before. And lo and behold, he won. Andrew Furey won the election. It's not surprising, considering the way the election was carried out. And what has the reaction to that been? Well, the reaction has been a member of the Green Party, a few Conservative members, and the leader of the NDP in Newfoundland, all filing in court to have the election results overturned. So that's a pretty big reaction for the other three parties to all think that this election wasn't fair, to all believe that the problems that were encountered in this election were great enough that it should be overturned. Which would be great if the Newfoundland court system wasn't horribly underfunded and glacial in its pace of resolving issues. So this election carried out in 2021 could be overturned in 2030 or 2035, whenever our court system is finished with it. Or it might go nowhere, like many court cases in Newfoundland do. And it might take 14 seconds of deliberation and the election's overturned, and now we have to deal with the fallout. Who knows? It's completely up in the air. So after the election, we had the budget come out between Moya Greene and Andrew Furey. The Newfoundland budget, which in itself was supposed to be a good thing for us, it was supposed to be us looking up. It promised to be greener in its approach to the environment. It promised us more green energy subsidies, more investment. So what it bought us was $1.5 million to help Newfoundlanders buy greener vehicles with a $2,500 rebate, which is about, a few percent of a green vehicle. And it afforded us a $500 subsidy for refitting your home with heating, with electric heat. Now, if you can find a company that will refit your home with electric heat for $500, could you please send me their number? I would love that. That'd be terrific, because you will never get it done for that price. Now, against the $1.5 million for greener energy, they have $280 million for oil and gas exploration. Exploration alone is $280 million. That's not including the other 37 million they have allocated for subsidies. That's not including the other 20 million they have to approve additional permits for exploration. They also hit on government management and the downsizing of management sectors. So they dissolved 3 branches of management for different programs, different things in Newfoundland, health and such. Dissolved 3 of them, brought them into different overhanging branches of management, and created 6 new committees in the House of Assembly. They went down 3, built 6. So that's, anyone who knows simple math, that's not less complicated. There's also the thought of capitalizing Newfoundland's social services and social programs, chief of which is the NLC. So the Newfoundland Liquor Corporation brings in $280 million a year for Newfoundland. That's almost $300 million a year in profit, not just revenue, but profit. And they want to sell it. They want to sell it off for a lump sum so Andrew Furey can pay down the deficit and look good for a little while. Even though future generations of Newfoundlanders won't get the revenue from that. They won't get the money from that anymore because it'll all be privatized. And privatization seems to be the goal here, as there are several services and crown corporations that are going to be reviewed and will move ahead with the information from that reviewing. This reviewing is going to be done by, quote unquote, independent services. And Moya Greene and Andrew Furey. Moya Greene is a capitalist. She is through and through.
30 seconds.
Thank you, Elizabeth. She's a member of the board of directors for Tim Hortons. which is a company rife with human rights abuses and legal actions taken against them. Is this really the person we need for an economic recovery plan in a province that has suffered for generations? Is that really what we want? What we need is socialist movement. What we need is a real plan of action to create a grassroots party. The Liberals aren't going to do it. The Conservatives aren't going to do it. And for the NDP to do it, there needs to be massive change within the NDP. And it needs to come from a hard left-oriented side. It needs to come from socialism and a radical thought process. If we don't get it, we're going to keep getting this lukewarm liberalism, neoliberalism, and neo-capitalism. That's all we're going to get if we don't get strong, radical change. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Victor. Now we will hear from Chris Wanamaker. Chris is a founding member of the Socialist Action Atlantic Branch. He is a founding member and former chair of the New Brunswick NDP Socialist Caucus and is presently a member of the New Brunswick NDP Provincial Council. He served as president of Local 2, Union of Northern Workers, which is a component of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, better known as PSAC. He was candidate for the New Brunswick NDP in the 2020 provincial election. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. And it's very interesting to hear Victor's portrait of Newfoundland and a very good summary of what's happening there. I'm here to talk about what's happening in New Brunswick. New Brunswick is a little bit different these days. Things are happening politically here that haven't been happening here for some time. The Canadian Union of Public Employees, otherwise known as CUPE, is on the move. They actually represent 28,000 workers in the province. And if you consider the family members and extended family members of these workers, you possibly could surmise that at least 100,000 people in New Brunswick benefit in some way from CUPE's presence. So their presence is actually fairly strong in this province. You might say almost, say 10% of the population. So when you look at it this way, you can see that they can have some influence. They are having some influence at the present time. They're becoming more militant in their approach. CUPE has been taking out full front page ads in the Irving newspaper, something that I've never seen before. And the union is using a symbol of a clenched fist in the ads, along with the phrase bargaining forward. And toward the end of May, the new CUPE president, Steve Drost, who seems to be more activist in his approach, issued an ultimatum that if the Higgs government does not offer fair wages by Labor Day, CUPE will organize a province-wide strike for its members. So this is still there. I mean, the situation hasn't been resolved yet. 10 days ago, CUPE announced that it's still 22,000 CUPE members still have not been able to settle their contracts. 22,000. And CUPE executive members recently met with Higgs about the contract of CUPE hospital workers, but felt like they were talking to a brick wall. Nothing happened. The hospital workers said that all that Higgs continued to want was a wage freeze. And this wage freeze has been established. It was established before Christmas, and it's still there. The hospital workers say that right now there's a recruitment and retention crisis happening in the hospitals. Emergency room service is being cut back in rural areas, much like it is in Newfoundland. And more sick people are going to the cities, so that emergency room wait times have gone through the roof. Ambulance service is less efficient because ambulance attendants have to wait until patients are admitted. And there's a shortage of approximately 700 nurses provincially. There's a shortage of 200 licensed practical nurses. There are 100 vacant paramedic positions, gaps in other services, environmental services, maintenance, clerical, medical device technology, phlebotomy. Postings of full-time positions are becoming less frequent. Management is relying on casual labor to fill the gap. And there was a news story about 6 months ago about one teenager who ended her life after waiting all night with a counselor to see a psychiatrist, not getting to see the psychiatrist and feeling like she was a burden to the world and to the system. So according to the CUPE announcement on July 19th, he still wants to go on with the wage freeze that he started before Christmas. And he started that in the middle of the second COVID-19 wave. And he said it would be a wage freeze for all workers, followed by 3 years of 1% increases. I'll repeat that. He said that there would be a wage freeze for all public sector workers, followed by 3 years of 1% increases. So bargaining deadlocks are piling up. And these deadlocks include 4,400 educational and clerical support staff in New Brunswick schools. They include at least 4 other locals that have filed for a status of deadlock negotiations. The hospital local has been conducting strike preparation training for its members, which is interesting. And members of other locals have been invited to participate in that as well. And just a few weeks ago, the Conservative government reached a deal with 2 New Brunswick bargaining units from the New Brunswick Nurses Union. They did reach a deal with them that will affect 6,000 nursing staff, that just at 2 of the units. And so that included nurses, nursing practitioners, some managers, and supervisors, apparently. But that's a cartoon in the local Irving-owned paper showed a smiling Premier Higgs with a "Let's make a deal" sign behind him, and he's saying, "Unions, come on down." The editorial that went with the cartoon said that CUPE should take notice. According to the editorial, the last thing people need is the threat of a general strike as we recover from the pandemic. And this is the kind of thing that people see daily in the Irving-owned papers. There was an editorial just yesterday that said municipal politicians must be careful about not playing into the hands of public sector unions as if this is a common consensus of some kind. So this being said, Daniel Legier, the president of the New Brunswick Federation of Labor, wrote a very good letter that was actually published in the editorial section of the paper, the Irving paper. He made the case that the province needs to invest a lot more in the public service, and in my view, that letter couldn't have been more timely. So lots happening in New Brunswick. We'll see how this plays out. It's going to be very interesting when Labor Day comes. We'll see what happens then. I'm kind of looking forward to the drama of this. I think New Brunswick workers are getting very angry at this point, and I think some mobilization is happening. I think more is happening these days than has happened for some time in New Brunswick.
Elizabeth, you're muted.
Sorry, see, I forgot to unmute myself. You did have more time. I was looking forward to your poem, but I guess you changed your mind.
Oh, no, I do have a poem. Shall I read my poem?
Okay, so yes, please. I'd like to hear it.
My poem is called "What is Austerity?" because Victor was talking about austerity. Higgs is talking about a wage freeze. What is austerity? Sometimes people get the words austerity and prosperity confused. Austerity is not prosperity. What is posterity? Something to do with your prostate? What is austerity? Osteoporosis? Austerity means cut back, delete, downsize, resize, one size fits all, lay off, tighten up, dim down, reduce, shrink, restructure, abnegation for the nation. Keep your pennies in the pot, save your cents for a sunny day. Learn what is allowed and what is not, or that will be a blot on you for not knowing your lot. For what have you bought? You will be tied in a knot. Agree to be taught, or you will be shot. Stay on your crutch for wanting too much. Do not make a sound. Keep your head down to the ground. Alone, no phone, no home, your nose to the grindstone, no skills to hone. You are out of the zone and on your own. Austere means nothing dear. No cheer, no beer, nothing to see here. While austere in your beer, cry no tears. There is no one to hear you. Let's play austerity bingo. Under the A, 0. Under the U, untold millions. Under the S, zilch. Under the T, minus trillions. Under the E, the economist. Under the R, restraint. Under the I, intellectual property. Under the T, minus 10 trillion. Under the Y, yes men and yes women. What's that spell? Austerity. What's that spell? Austerity. What's that spell? Austerity. Abandon prosperity. Let's have a round of applause for austerity. So there you go.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Okay, so now we're going to go to Kurt, our producer, and he has questions. So the first, he will put 3 questions in the chat column, and he will so that you can he's going to read them too. And Victor will start off the answers, and Chris will be second. And you will have each up to 5 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions. It's your choice. Okay, Kurt, go ahead.
Okay. Our first question is, do people still leave Newfoundland to go to other parts of Canada where jobs are better? Next question is, it was predicted at the time of Confederation that the Maritime Province would be financially destroyed. Would there be a benefit for Newfoundland to secede? And our final question is, how can we hold politicians more accountable for their promises?
Okay, so Victor, you have up to 5 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3.
All right, I will start with the first one. Do people still leave for other provinces? Yes. That is a hard yes. That is something that they brought up in the budget conference 101 times, that young people leave. So what is their answer to young people leaving? It is to increase tuition in our post-secondary education. So if you're thinking, wow, that's a little bit backwards, it is. It's going from $2,500 in Mon University to $6,000. That was one of their ways to, I don't know, keep people here, entice people to stay, charge them more money. That was a great idea. The economics of Newfoundland is not great. Our work here is dwindling. If you don't get a job at McDonald's or Walmart or a family business, you're likely not going to get one. That's why Newfoundland has an extremely high poverty rate and an extremely high unemployment rate. So the NDP convention, the proposal was brought up of a $15 minimum wage. That was what we were going to campaign on. And Comrade Weisletter, thank God, got on the floor and argued for a $20 minimum wage. And that is what you would need to keep young people from leaving Newfoundland. It is not a child tax credit. It is not a $500 rebate for redoing the electrical in your house. It is not a sports credit for doing physical activity. There needs to be higher minimum wage here. There needs to be better access to health care. There needs to be better access to public funds to get glasses and other things. Because living in Newfoundland is expensive. It's very expensive. All of our drugs here cost a ridiculous amount compared to other places in Canada. And shipping doesn't help with that. Getting anything here is expensive. Second question is, would there be a benefit to secede? That is a very difficult question to answer. While there are clear benefits to seceding, one of which is a greater control over our natural resources as a province, you have to keep in mind of who that is. So many of our politicians are in the deep pockets of oil industries, in the deep pockets of corporations. If we seceded, it's likely that the majority of those in power would be bought and paid for. So would we have a benefit? Maybe, but it would likely be on the capitalists where most of the benefit would fall. Right now, the benefit we are having from the federal government is they're paying down a little bit of the debt that the provincial government keeps building. So that's one benefit that we really need right now. Muskrat Falls is a good example of that. The projected budget of that was $6 billion. It has since ballooned to $13 billion, double and then some what it was supposed to be, years past its finish date. And the only reason the costs are going to be manageable is because of a $5 billion windfall from the federal government. And you could easily make the argument maybe it would have been better if the province had taken care of all of it in the beginning and not asked the federal government for help, not created Nalcor to do this. And you'd probably be right, but we can play what if all day. The problem is we need to hold our politicians accountable, which is the third question, can we hold them more accountable? In Newfoundland, it's difficult. We have the House of Assembly and we have our Premier. We can protest and we can fight and we can argue. What we need are more politicians on the floor willing to voice the opinions of the people. So we need more radical leftists. We need younger politicians. We need people who have ideals and goals to fight for. And the sooner we get that, the sooner we can hold them to account, because a politician is much less likely to side with a corporation or side with the billionaires when their public image is totally destroyed in the House of Assembly because you came with a completely well-pointed argument and told it like it was. So we need accountability. And I think a good way to get that is to get more active, radical people running, to get more people who care about accountability in our political sector. And that's all I have there.
Okay, well, thank you. And of course, coming back, talking about politicians, the title tonight was Newfoundland Fighting the Furey-ous Cuts, is because the Premier of Newfoundland's name, of course, is Fury. Okay, so Chris, over to you.
I think that it was my own question that I was asking about how can we hold politicians more accountable for their promises. And I like what Victor said about people going into the House and making passionate arguments. In New Brunswick, there's an alternative media. It's called the New Brunswick Media Co-op, and it has alternative news stories to the Irving-owned media. And those are very well researched and well done. It's a volunteer organization by and large. They do get donations. I don't know if people get honorariums or not, but the stories are remarkable, and they're stories that you would never see in the local Irving-owned press. And I think that that information is very important. New Brunswick has a 50% literacy rate. And if you looked at the political literacy rate, then that political literacy rate, I think, would be higher. By political literacy rate, I mean people who are versed in politics. I'm currently helping out the local executive of the NDP, the federal executive, to get signatures on forms for candidates who are considering running in the federal election. And as we're going around getting these signatures, or trying to, we're finding that people are extremely disenchanted with politicians, and they don't want to sign for that reason. And a number of them, many of them, are saying, well, no, I don't vote. I haven't voted in a long time. And my fear is that the people who are most disadvantaged are the ones who are most disenchanted with the political system. So I think political literacy needs to happen. I think general literacy needs to happen, and I think an alternative media can help. If people don't have information, if they're left in the dark, then of course they're not going to be able to be very radical. So they're not going to protest. They're just going to try to accept their lot in life, which is very sad.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So we're going to go back to Kurt now for 3 more questions. Kurt?
Okay, so our next question is, in face of the blatant lies by the politicians, how will the general public respond to this? Are they actually doing anything that has an impact on the governmental bodies? And I think that's in response to Victor's presentation about the fact that the Liberals completely stated that they didn't make any of the claims that they made. Our next question is, who is getting rich in Newfoundland, Labrador? Who owns the energy resources, the lumber industry, the fishery, retail chains, mines, and agriculture in the province? And finally, Newfoundland and Labrador has either been Tory or Liberal, provincial or federal. Do you think if people supported the NDP and they formed the government, things would be better?
Okay, so you've heard the 3 questions, and you each have up to 5 minutes again to answer 1, 2, or 3. It's your choice. And we're going to start with Chris and then Victor.
Yeah, I'm learning as much as everybody else is about the situation in Newfoundland. One of the questions in the back of my mind that relates to the question that you posed, Elizabeth, is why do people just simply vote Liberal or Conservative in these provinces? And it seems to me that in New Brunswick, they are starting to think that other possibilities can happen. They started to vote for the Green Party. 3 Green MLAs got elected, and they started to vote for the People's Alliance Party, a right-wing party, but at least that was different than what has happened before. So it seems that the main political parties are fraying at the edges now. And I think that that's a good thing. I hope it continues. I hope that the NDP makes further progress in New Brunswick. I can only speak to the New Brunswick situation. I can't speak to the Newfoundland situation, but we have a new socialist Action Atlantic branch, which includes people from Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI. And I think that that's a wonderful step in the right direction. There are protests more often happening in New Brunswick these days. Everything from Black Lives Matter to protests about all kinds of things. Actually, if I made a list, you might be surprised. So there is this. There's a housing crisis here. There's a rental crisis here, and that's becoming a big thing in New Brunswick as well. So I think things are starting to happen in New Brunswick very slowly. I think these are pre-revolutionary times in New Brunswick. They may be for a while, but I think what's happening is important. So.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Victor?
So the first question is, in the face of lying politicians, what do we do? In Newfoundland, it can go one of two ways. It can either blow up and your political career is ruined pretty much forever, or it can completely glaze over and never be spoken about again. And it almost entirely depends on how the media reacts to it. So we had a conservative, keep in mind now this man is a conservative politician, lifelong conservative here in this area, who a few years ago ran the ABC campaign in Newfoundland, which is an acronym for anything but conservative. So the Newfoundland Conservative Party is not now, nor will it ever be in line with the federal Conservative Party. So his argument was, we need any politician in that isn't a conservative, be it Liberal, NDP, Green, Bloc Québécois, whatever you want to vote for. So what do we do with lying politicians in Newfoundland? Well, it usually comes up to something like that. Either it's extreme in its reaction, or there is no reaction. And in the House, there was a fairly poignant reaction to the Liberals stating that this was never said, and they were called out by many members of the House of Assembly on the floor. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere, which is not surprising in that way, because our politicians lie all the time. But we definitely need people to be more willing to step to the plate to say, it's not good enough, to say, no, you just lied to the people to get votes. There needs to be not a mechanism of punishment, but a mechanism of accountability where you can say, okay, well, you're standing there on the podium and you're saying something that was completely false. So the speaker at that point, I think, in my personal opinion, should bring up documentation stating, no, this is what you said to the public, this was the statement you made, and now you're walking back on it. And I think if we could have more transparency, we would have more accountability, but that's problematic in Newfoundland for a lot of reasons, chief of which is how our government is set up here. The second question is, who's getting rich? Not Newfoundlanders. We own one industry. That's it. One industry is all Newfoundland owned here in this province, and that is the forestry. All of our oil, except for 10-15% that might be owned by a crown corporation, is owned by either the federal Canadian government or the United States. Our energy infrastructure, Newfoundland and Labrador, or Newfoundland Light and Power, now is what they've rebranded to, is a subsidiary of Fortis Inc., which is technically owned by the U.S. as well. Most of our mines are privately owned by companies from outside Newfoundland. Our fisheries, our sanctuary for Newfoundland income, pretty much, sold off 10 fishing plants within the last 2 years. So our fisheries, which were always Newfoundland owned, now have 10 fishing plants owned by Royal Greenland, which is another crown corporation from another country. Why we did that, I do not know, because they compete directly with our homegrown fisheries. They fight directly with us for market shares. Yet we sold them fisheries and gave them rights to fishing grounds that they wouldn't have had otherwise, that now they have, and it's a complete bonus for them, and it does nothing but hurt us. The last question is, could the NDP be better if they formed government? Probably. The problem with that is the NDP don't seem to want to in Newfoundland. They need to be louder, they need to be more radical, they need to be more organized, they need to get their message out more. And the problem is the news sites here and the media here don't care about the NDP. The NDP got 6.2% in the last election. You're not going to see NTV News or CBC roll up to the NDP's office and ask them a whole bunch of questions, because they're not going to win with 6.2%. So it's very two-party system here, even though it is a Canadian, electoral system and we have multiple parties. There were no NDP signs put up in all of the Coast of Bays area, in all of central Newfoundland in the last provincial election. There were none. In communities of 4,000, 5,000, 11,000, 15,000 people, there were no NDP signs. There was no one campaigning for the NDP. There was no one fighting to get the NDP more votes. So even if they formed government, they need to have better organization than that. And there needs to be real change in the Newfoundland NDP to swing them harder left, to make them louder, to make them more radical. They need to confront things up front. Putting out a press release and putting out posts on their website is not good enough. They need to have their voices heard. I think if they did that, and if they formed government, and if they had more support, I think they would be better. Their policies, their base platform is 100% better than the other two parties. And if they got into government and could implement that, yes, it would 100% be better. Newfoundland would be doing better as a whole. The problem is getting there.
Okay. Thank you, Victor. Okay, so we're going back to Kurt for 3 more questions. Kurt, go ahead.
Okay, so our first question is, are any of the utilities in Newfoundland privatized? Our next question is, did Newfoundland enter Canada voluntarily? And our final question for this round is, are people in Newfoundland communities angry about the way they are being treated? If so, why do they keep electing the same types of government political parties?
Okay, so you each have up to 5 minutes again. And Victor, we will start with you.
So the first question about privatization of utilities. Technically, yes and no. And I know that's a bit of a cop-out for an answer, but technically yes and no. There are crown corporations that are set up for our utilities. The problem is those crown corporations are run by millionaires who sit on the board of directors for other companies, and their baseline objective is profit. So while it's technically a crown corporation, it is 100% a privatized system. Even though it doesn't bear the name, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And that's what we have right now. That's what Nalcor is, which set up Muskrat Falls. It was supposed to be a completely public system, but it's not. It's ran by millionaires who really don't care about the public of Newfoundland and really don't care clearly about getting the system up and running, because it's years over its supposed setup date and start date. It's, again, $6 billion over budget. And it's been the victim, I say victim lightly, of many public inquiries and Freedom of Information Act inquiries. And that has led to many people losing their jobs, many people getting fired, and some people maybe getting in legal trouble. And again, the Newfoundland Light and Power Corporation is owned by Fortis Inc., which is technically a foreign company. So our light and power structure here, our electricity, we technically pay to a company that is owned by a company from the United States. So it is technically, again, a crown corporation, but only in name alone. The second question is let's go to the last one. That I think that one's a little important as well. Why do we keep electing the same people? It's because Newfoundland has a very sparse selection of politicians. And in Newfoundland, there's people you would vote for, people you might vote for, and people you would never vote for. And it tends to be the same groups of people all the time, and it tends to be the same small group of people all the time. If you have the Liberals and Conservatives, and one looks a little bit better than the other one, you usually pick the lesser of two evils because you know the other ones aren't going to win, even if you like them more, or the other ones are just not what you want at all. The Liberals and Conservatives have been doing this for years, flip-flopping back and forth between Liberal control, Conservative control, Liberal control, and Conservative control. Nothing gets any better. Nothing improves. Nothing in Newfoundland substantially changes. But the other options are a Green Party that is almost non-existent in Newfoundland. There is almost no Green Party presence here. And again, an NDP that people have this thought built up in their mind of they won't win. They can't win. There's no path to victory for them. So they choose who they're going to vote for based on the lesser of two evils and who's more likely to win. So that usually ends up being the Liberals or the Conservatives, depending on their platform at the particular point in time that the election's called, which could flip-flop either way. The Conservatives in Newfoundland have had more Liberal-leaning platforms than the Liberals have had in Newfoundland in some years. And the Liberals have had more Conservative platforms than the Conservatives have had in some years. It usually bears down in an election to one or two key issues. And one of the main reasons that, not in this previous provincial election, but the provincial election before this, one of the key reasons the Conservatives lost was because they were hitting at our healthcare constantly. They said they were going to cut more of our healthcare. They said they were going to cut more doctors. They disrespected a lot of healthcare workers. And that was the key reason they lost. And in this election that just passed, it was kind of the same thing on the Liberal side of, well, we're going to put some money into healthcare here and there, but we're also not going to go nuts with it. We're going to be very conservative with our spending. And again, they're bringing in a lot of austerity measures, which Newfoundland does not need. It will not improve our economic outlook. This is going to make the province as a whole look better economically, but it's going to make the people of Newfoundland suffer far, far more than we have in recent years. These austerity measures are going to damage a lot of lives and potentially end a lot of lives of elderly Newfoundlanders who cannot afford it.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Before we move on to Chris, I would like to take a bit of a stab at the question, did Newfoundland enter Canada voluntarily? The answer is a definite no. We did not. And I say that because I was raised in Newfoundland. According to my parents, of course, I wasn't old enough to remember any of this, but according to my parents, it was bought and paid for, and it was even more corrupt than that. And if you really want to know the true story of how Newfoundland joined Confederation, there's a wonderful book, and it's called Don't Tell the Newfoundlanders, and it's by Greg Malone. So, Judy, the answer to your question is no. There wasn't, I don't think, was any Newfoundlanders that went into this voluntarily. Okay, so Chris?
So I think there are themes that are coming out here. One theme is appearance versus reality. And I think that we have to look beneath the appearance of things to find the reality. I also think that we have to follow the money to find the reality of things. And I think the money trails are sometimes very opaque. They're very hidden. But if we can suss them out, they will reveal a lot. And I think that people are living, at least in New Brunswick, and of course I can really only talk about New Brunswick. I can't talk about Newfoundland. I think in New Brunswick, people are feeling this disconnect. I think that they see problems happening around them and they don't have any real explanation for why they're happening. They can't really say why inflation is happening, for example, why the rental crisis is happening, um, why why the wages are so low, and there seems to be kind of a grit and bear it kind of mentality among a lot of people. You know, we can't do anything about this. Politics doesn't work. You know, it's kind of like just surrendering to the way things are. Aside from the kinds of things that I was talking about earlier, the new developments that seem to be happening, but yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering. I guess I'm answering, trying to answer the question: why are people not angrier? And it seems to me that there's a kind of a passivity in a lot of cases, so rather than anger. And there are stages of change that we know that the first stage of change is where people don't realize that there's a need to make a change. The second stage of change is where people start to think politically about things, and and politics becomes personal. Um, the political becomes personal, and then the third stage is where people move into action and say something really has to be done, and I'm going to try to do something. So I guess people can be at various stages of change politically. I asked the question to Chris Thompson, the interim leader of the New Brunswick NDP, why people, if all the political parties are basically the same. And he said of that at that time that the Conservatives were the worst, the Liberals were a little bit better than they were, the Greens were a little bit better than they were, and the NDP were a little bit better than the Greens. It's interesting what Victor said about Conservatives sometimes being more liberal than the Liberals, and Liberals sometimes being more conservative than the Conservatives. I think people need to be educated about political ideology, and if they can understand more what the ideology of their political party is, they'll understand a lot more. If they understand more the ideologies of capitalism, they'll understand a lot more.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Okay, so we're going to go back to Kurt for our last three questions. Go ahead, Kurt.
Okay, so our first question is: it's no surprise that liberals and Tories serve the needs of big corporations. What are the unions and the NDP doing to fight the cuts, fight the reset of Andrew Furey, and strive for a better, more just, and more equal society? Is there a discussion of socialism as an alternative to capitalist rule, as many young people are demanding? Our next question is: what is the literacy level in Newfoundland? And our final question is: what is the situation facing women in Newfoundland?
Okay, so you each have up to 5 minutes again, and this time we will start with Chris and go to Victor. I know the questions are mostly about Newfoundland, but Chris, you've been doing a wonderful job sort of relating them to New Brunswick as well. So go ahead.
Yeah, so there is starting to be a discussion of socialism in New Brunswick just by virtue of the fact that more people have started to join socialist action. And I think that's good. That is partly in response to our presence at protests, at least in St. John. A few people have come up to me after I've given a speech or been at a protest with a Socialist Action banner, and they've been interested in what Socialist Action is. And there is even another socialist group that has started up that is more parliamentary in its orientation. So it seems to be less revolutionary and more parliamentary, if you want to put it that way. They're more interested in electoral politics. But that's not something that I would have guessed would have happened, that there would have been this interest in socialism. Even within the New Brunswick NDP, there is a resurgence of interest in socialism. The new leader of the NDP is a member of Socialist Action, the interim leader, and the person who's running for the leadership, who quite possibly will become the leader, is also a member of Socialist Action. And various members of the NDP are members. So there is this interest in socialism that has just mushroomed in this province, to my great surprise. I've been a member of Socialist Action for, I think, since 2015, since I saw Barry Wise' letter outside a conference with the World Social Forum in Montreal, and he recruited me at that time, but I was the only New Brunswick member. And now we have, we have a handful at least, so that's wonderful. So I think there is a kind of a growing interest. It was really interesting even that the NDP leader a while back, Jennifer McKenzie, described herself as a socialist, even though she didn't explain what kind of socialist she was. And she definitely did not seem to be a revolutionary, but she did describe herself as a socialist. And various people have done well in politics recently, by describing themselves as socialists. I think in France, in Portugal, in Peru, socialists have been doing well lately. So it does seem to be a kind of a phenomenon that is kind of spreading throughout the world, even in the U.S. Socialism. Richard Wolff gets a tremendous audience with his YouTube videos. So, we're all connected, we're all interconnected, and what's happening in New Brunswick might be a small reflection of what's happening in the world as well. Maybe what's happening in Newfoundland or starting to happen there could also be a reflection of what's happening in the world. I don't know.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Victor?
So the first question is, are the unions fighting, and is the message of socialism catching on more? The unions are definitely up in arms. QP right now is striking in Grand Falls and other areas. They're not happy. They found out on Facebook they were being locked out and that there were no more discussions. If you're a solidified, founded union and you have to find out through social media that you're being locked out, there's something wrong there. There was no communication from government to tell them what was happening. There was no letter, email, or phone call, or carrier pigeon or smoke signal that went up saying that they were being locked out. They got to the building to go to work. The door was locked, and one of them said, check Facebook, and they did, and that's how they found out they were locked out. If that is not the extreme height of disrespect, I have no idea what is, because when you are a solidified union representing hundreds and thousands of workers province-wide, and the government doesn't respect you enough to simply send a phone call along, that is horrific. And there will definitely be more protests, not just from QP, but labor will likely be protesting soon. Students' unions and teacher unions will likely be protesting the increase in MUN's tuition from $2,500 to $6,000. People are not happy here, and you're going to see more protests. You're going to see more action being taken. And the second part of that question is socialism catching on a bit more? I've had many conservatives tell me in no short terms that if the NDP swung a more socialist message, a more left message, now they didn't say left and they didn't say socialist, but if they did, they would vote for them. These are conservatives, again, but they said if the NDP was more socialist in its message, more health care, more province-wide child care, more care for the elderly, then they would have voted for the NDP. So if the NDP takes up a more left mantle, a more socialist mantle, you will see conservative voters who are only conservative in name, but very open to their politics and very open to their financial politics. You'll see a lot more people flock to the NDP here. The second question is literacy in Newfoundland. It depends. It depends heavily. If you're in a population sector, say Gander or Grand Falls or St. John, and you go to a smaller community, say 3,000 people, you get lower. You get to about 70%. The town I mentioned a little while ago, Fortune Harbor and Cottles Cove, they have literacy percents that would probably make you cry if you were to look at them. A lot of people can't read. A lot of people can't write. They don't have the funding for all that much public education. There is a school in Cottles Cove, and last I checked, it had 11 students. And it's there. They're really making a go of it, but there's also the sense in Newfoundland from a lot of young Newfoundlanders and a lot of old Newfoundlanders of what's the point? Why bother? Because they grow up in a situation where their family is on welfare. They're on social assistance. And going and getting a job making minimum wage will get you less money. You can't survive on it, so why would you bother? So you need to read and write to go get a job, and if they're not going to go get a job at McDonald's and suffer it out for a few years to make barely enough money to survive, they would rather go cut wood with their father or their grandfather. They would rather go fish. They lead simpler lives than the government requests of them. And that isn't a dig at them. It's the way our province is set up. It's set up that it's easier to be on social assistance than it is to get a job and work minimum wage, because minimum wage in Newfoundland is very much a slavery wage. It is a starvation wage. You will go from paycheck to paycheck wondering what you're going to eat. You will go paycheck to paycheck wondering how you're going to pay rent. That is not a question. That is a surety on minimum wage. I've worked on it. I know how difficult it is. You cannot support yourself, let alone a family, on minimum wage. There's no 2-car garage, sending your kids to college and your spouse not working. That's not happening here. You have the choice of work minimum wage and suffer, or go on social assistance and hope for the best. And the third question is situation facing women. Again, it depends. In the workforce, it depends. In construction work and in automobile work and things like that, you do face a lot of sexism. Personal experiences of my own, my mother has faced discrimination from automobile repair companies. When she took her car in, she was treated like she knew nothing. She was treated like some ignorant bay woman who had no idea what a car was. My aunt, who lives up the road, who owns a business, who is a businesswoman, has had to deal with sexism from dealers, from distributors, from people who she buys her product off of. They talk to her like she's a little bit less. But now in the industrialized jobs, in the corporatized jobs, you're not going to get as much of that. And there was a good part of the budget, there are a few of them, but there was a good part of the budget for 2021 that came out that is allocating, I believe it was $30,000, which is a small amount, not nearly enough, but it was $30,000 to buy period products for students in school. So not as many young women and young girls would have to either miss school or go home from school early because of not having access to adequate female products, which is a little frustrating on my part, because all going through high school, a guy could go get a condom in the male washroom and there was no problem. The dispenser's there. They have pregnancy control there. There's a form of birth control that men can go acquire in the school. But there are no women products in the women's bathroom. And that to me is a little bit offensive. But other than those glaring issues, Newfoundland, in terms of its social norms, is a little more progressive than you would expect. I myself, as an LGBTQ member of that community, I haven't faced that much discrimination in my adult life. School was hard, but it wasn't all that bad in terms of the majority. There's a few problem people, and you get that in anything, but Newfoundland is a lot more progressive socially than people think it is. There are, of course, old school islanders who don't understand the differences of gender and sex. They don't understand the differences of gender fluidity. They don't understand certain things like that. But Newfoundland socially is not all that bad.
Okay. Thank you very much, Victor. In fact, a special thanks to Victor and Chris, and to Kurt, our producer in Mississauga, and of course to all our viewers and listeners on YouTube. So please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.canada And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com or just call us 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. And once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. So, fellow listeners and viewers, I have some good news and I have some bad news. The bad news is that during August, Socialist Action will be taking a break, so there will be no webcasts in August. Sorry. But the good news, in September, SA webcast will be on Thursday, September the 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be back. The topic will be announced in the next few weeks. But in the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active. Bye for now.